Hi guys, welcome to the second video from chapter 12 from the Sign of Four. In this video we're going to look at the middle section of Jonathan Small's confession and see more about how he gained the treasure and eventually how he ends up losing the treasure. But before we do, let's just quickly recap the events so far in chapter 12. So chapter 12 is Jonathan Small's confession. And at the beginning of chapter 12, we find out a lot of information about Jonathan Small's life before he joined the army and Jonathan Small's life in the army. And from these experiences, we have to say, Jonathan Small is a very unlucky character. And certainly the dangerous situations that he finds himself in could quite often be attributed to poor luck or, generally just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Think about getting his leg bitten off by a crocodile, being in India during the Indian Mutiny. And that in itself is the second big thing that we find a lot about in the beginning of chapter 12. So to recap, the Indian Mutiny was when Indian soldiers trained by the British rose up and tried to overthrow their masters because they had been forced to fire weapons and deal with ammunition that had been stored in beef fat. If you remember, we covered that back in the first video for this chapter. So that backdrop of the Indian Mutiny leads to Jonathan Small being holed up in the Agra fort trying to protect a small number of white Western Europeans and indigenous people who are still seen as loyal to the British government. And this leads to Jonathan Small being put in charge of a door with two other guys, Abdullah Khan and Malmet Singh. And that is where we pick up the story here. So I'll just continue. The third night of my watch was dark and dirty, with a small driving rain. It was dreary work standing in the gateway hour after hour in such weather. I tried again and again to make my seats talk, but without much success. At 2 in the morning the rounds passed and broke for a moment the weariness of the night. Finding that my companions would not be led into conversation, I took out my pipe and laid down my musket to strike the match. In an instant the two Sikhs were upon me. One of them snatched my firelock up and levelled it at my head, while the other held a great knife to my throat and swore between his teeth that he would plunge it into me if I moved a step. My first thought was that these fellows were in league with the rebels and that this was the beginning of an assault. If our door were in the hands of the sepoys, the place must fall, and the women and children be treated as they were in Cawnpore. Maybe you gentlemen think that I am just making out a case for myself, but I give you my word that when I thought of that, though I felt the point of the knife at my throat, I opened my mouth with the intention of giving a scream, if it was to be my last one, which might alarm the main guard. The man who held me seemed to know my thoughts, for even as I braced myself to it, he whispered, "Don't make a noise, the fort is safe enough. There are no rebel dogs on this side of the river." There was the ring of truth in what he said, and I knew that if I raised my voice I was a dead man. I could read it in the fellow's brown eyes. I waited, therefore, in silence, to see what it was that they wanted from me. "Listen to me, Sahib," said the taller and fiercer of the pair, the one whom they called Abdullah Khan. "You must either be with us now, or you must be silenced forever. The thing is too great a one for us to hesitate." Okay, so let's just quickly cover up a few points. So we have the use of pathetic fallacy, and we're going to see this right up to the point where the merchant Achmet is murdered. So the weather being dark and dirty, pathetic fallacy, foreshadowing that something bad is going to happen. And yeah, something bad is going to happen. We then see that Jonathan Small didn't necessarily enjoy the work that he'd been assigned to. He found it dreary, and he describes it as weary. The weariness of the night. And this may be Jonathan Small not enjoying the work, or it may be Jonathan Small feeling that he is overworked with all of the stresses of the situation upon him. We then get the beginning of Jonathan Small trying to justify his actions later on in this chapter. He is held hostage to some extent, with a gun pointed at his head and a knife put to his throat. He is threatened with that knife, Abdullah Khan says that he will stab him, he will kill him if he makes a noise. And this shows that Jonathan Small is acting under threat. This may be seen as like a legal defence, But I think at this point, Jonathan Small is just trying to convince Sherlock Holmes and Othello Jones that he didn't have a choice in what was going on, or what he was going to do next. And I think this takes us back to the idea of Jonathan Small as potentially an unreliable narrator. You know, this narrator who doesn't necessarily give us the truth because of their personal bias or because they were absent for some of the story. And I think here definitely it's Jonathan Small's personal bias. We can't tell whether Jonathan Small really was threatened into stealing the treasure. We can't tell whether Jonathan Small was just an accessory or whether he was the mastermind behind this the whole time. We don't get any other accounts, so we can't say what is true and what is not. So this, again, this is Jonathan Small unlucky to be taken hostage like this by the two guys that you're guarding the door with. That's really, really unlucky. To be posted at the door where this plot, this entire scheme to steal the Agra treasure is all going to come to a head, to be put in that position in itself is a pretty unlucky thing to happen. So this is just developing the idea that Jonathan Small is an unlucky guy. He references Cawnpore. This was a real thing that really happened. There was a massacre there where 120 women and children, white European women and children, were murdered by indigenous forces who again were trying to rebel. We then get a little bit more to support the idea that Jonathan Small is an unreliable narrator. He says, maybe you gentlemen think that I'm just making out a case for myself. I'd say it's suspicious. That's the second time now in this chapter that Jonathan Small has referenced to the fact that, you know, I might be lying, or maybe you think that I'm lying. It's strange that he would bring that up so often when he's trying to come across as he's telling the truth. You know, I personally find that a little bit suspicious. We see here that Abdullah Khan is on the side of Britain. He describes the rebels as rebel dogs, so that Abdullah Khan is trying to establish some sort of connection and rapport with Jonathan Small by saying, you know, look, I'm on your side. Those guys over there are dogs. And then finally on this page we get a little description of Abdullah Khan. He's described as being taller and fiercer than Malmet Singh. And note, you know, I haven't written this down, but note the use of comparative adjectives: taller, fiercer. Any adjective that has ER at the end is a comparative. It's comparing. So this says that Malmet Singh is still tall and still fierce, but Abdullah Khan is taller and fiercer than Malmet Singh. And this is quite a stereotypical fierce Sikh warrior image that would have been put around in Victorian times, and it kind of makes them seem like intimidating figures. And again, it could be Jonathan Small describing them in this way to further justify his actions. You know, if he says that these are two weedy little guys, then why don't you just overpower them? But if he describes them as being these tall, big, beastly, brutish guys, then it's more understandable that he just did exactly what they asked. And eventually, you know, they threatened to silence him forever. They threatened to kill him. So very much Jonathan Small doesn't have much of a choice when it comes to what he's going to do next. Okay. Either you are heart and soul with us on your oath on the cross of the Christians, or your body this night shall be thrown into the ditch, and we shall pass over to our brothers in the rebel army. There is no middle way. Which is it to be, death or life? We can only give you 3 minutes to decide, for the time is passing and all must be done before the rounds come again. How can I decide? Said I. You have not told me what you want of me, but I tell you now that if it is anything against the safety of the fort, I will have no truck with it, so you can drive home your knife and welcome. It is nothing against the fort, said he. We only ask you to do that which your countrymen come to this land for. We ask you to be rich. If you will be one with us this night, we will swear to you upon the naked knife and by the threefold oath which no Sikh was ever known to break, that you shall have your fair share of the loot. 1/4 of the treasure shall be yours. We can say no fairer. But what is the treasure then? I asked. I am as ready to be rich as you can be, if you will but show me how it can be done. You will swear then, said he, by the bones of your father, by the honour of your mother, by the cross of your faith, to raise no hand and speak no word against us, either now or afterwards. I will swear it, I answered, provided that the fort is not endangered. Then my comrade and I will swear that you shall have a quarter of the treasure, which shall be equally divided among the four of us. There are but three, said I. No, Dost Akbar must have his share. So, moving on. So we get a sense of the strength of this pact, of the importance of this pact, when he says that you are either heart and soul with us. And this is the foundation of the sign of four, really, that they are loyal and honourable, and they only act in the interest of each other because they have all sworn heart and soul. Heart being your physical life, that's your health, your physicality, and soul being your spiritual existence. So like your soul, your afterlife, whether you're going to get to heaven or not. It's that kind of pact. It's really, really strong. And he asked him to swear on the cross of the Christians, using religious imagery to try to appeal to Jonathan Small and make him understand how important this pact really is. It's the same as if you were to be in court, you'd have to swear on a Bible. You're swearing an oath on your soul, on your afterlife. And that's what Abdullah Khan is asking Jonathan Small to do here. We then get a little indication that actually Abdullah Khan has a little bit less honour. He talks about how if he doesn't, then they'll kill him, throw him in a ditch, and then pass over to our brothers in the rebel army. Now think about the contrasting words there. So he calls them dogs a few sentences ago, and he calls them brothers here. So I think this shows that Muhammad Singh, Abdullah Khan, Dost Akbar, they don't really have any loyalties to anybody but each other. And that definitely comes out here. They don't mind whether they're with the British or with the Indians. If this is a really important quotation to remember. If something comes up about empire or colonialism, please bear this in mind. Abdullah Khan says to Jonathan Small, "We only ask you to do that which your countrymen come to this land for." This shows that Abdullah Khan recognises that white Europeans have come to India to steal from Indians. That they are only there to make money, to get rich, and to take things away from the indigenous people living in India. And that's what's going to happen. They're going to steal these jewels from the merchant Ahmed and murder him. So maybe even murder factors into this statement, that we only ask you to do that which your countrymen come to this land for, stealing from Indian people and murdering Indian people. It shows that the natives understand that situation as well. That Abdullah Khan can say this shows that he recognises that white European people are only there to kind of hurt Indian people. And in Jonathan Small's response, he demonstrates the level of greed that he has. He says, "I am as ready to be rich as you can be." So this might link with the idea of material wealth, that Jonathan Small wants money to try and improve his life. But also, as we'll see in a moment, he's talking about social status. And indeed, Jonathan Small is the only character in this novel who wants to improve his social status. He sees himself as working class, poor, he has no power. He potentially sees getting this amount of money as a route to getting more power, to rising through the ranks of the Victorian social hierarchy. And we'll see that develops further in a moment. Abdullah Khan then asks him to swear on the bones of your father, the honour of your mother, and the cross of your faith. So this is a rule of three, a tricolon-ish. Yeah, by the. It's similar grammatical forms. But the rule of three here is religious. It's symbolic. Where you see a rule of three, think about maybe does it relate to the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost, one of the big tenets of Christianity. And I think using the language here, Abdullah Khan is communicating that kind of rule of three, trying to appeal to Jonathan Small's Christian side. Because again, he brings up the cross of your faith, swearing on the cross of your faith. Okay. So, no, Dost Akbar must have his share. We can tell the tale to you while we await them. Do you stand at the gate, Mallet Singh, and give notice of their coming? The thing stands thus, Sahib, and I tell it to you because I know that an oath is binding upon a Ferengi, and that we may trust you. Had you been a lying Hindu, though you had sworn by all the gods in their false temples, your blood would have been upon the knife, and your body in the water. But the Sikh knows the Englishman, and the Englishman knows the Sikh. Hearken, then, to what I have to say. There is a Raja in the northern provinces who has much wealth, though his lands are small. Much has come to him from his father, and more still he has set by himself, for he is of a low nature and hoards his gold rather than spend it. When the troubles broke out, he will be friends with both the lion and the tiger, with the sepoy and the company's Raj. Soon, however, it seemed to him that the white men's day was come, for through all the land he could hear of nothing but of their death and their overthrow. Yet being a careful man, he made such plans that, come what might, half at least of his treasure should be left to him. That which was in gold and silver he kept by him in the vaults of his palace, but the most precious stones and the choicest pearls that he had he put in an iron box and sent it by a trusty servant who, under the guise of a merchant, should take it to the fort at Agra, there to lie until the land is at peace. Thus, if the rebels won, he would have his money, but if the company conquered, his jewels would be saved to him. Having thus discovered his hoard, he threw himself into the cause of the sepoys, since they were strong upon his borders. By doing this, mark you, Sahib, his property becomes the due of those who have been true to their salt. Okay, so just to cover a few things here. Here, Abdullah Khan is relaying to Jonathan Small the details of the treasure, where it's coming from, who's carrying it, all this kind of stuff. He makes this statement: an oath is binding upon a Ferengi. Now, a Ferengi is a derogatory term for a white-skinned foreigner. It's kind of like a racist term for a white person. And it took me a little bit of time to think this through, but why? Why is an oath binding upon a Ferengi? Why is why is an oath binding upon a white person in this scenario? I think it is because the plan rests on Jonathan Small complying, and Abdullah Khan can tell him everything, because Jonathan Small would be in most trouble if they were caught. If the British authorities found that Jonathan Small was working with two Sikh guys to steal something that by rights, if discovered, should belong to the British government, because they control the Agra fort at this time, and if they captured those jewels, they would use them to further the empire, then Jonathan Small would be in more trouble than Mallet Singh and Abdullah Khan. Simply because Jonathan Small's loyalties should always lie to the crown and to the army. So he should take this to his superiors and tell them what's going on. So that's why I think Abdullah Khan says that an oath is binding upon a Ferengi. We then see a little bit of racism within the Indian community. He describes Hindus as liars and having false gods, and that he would have killed them straight away if it was a Hindu. I think that in this way Conan Doyle tries to explore the idea of racism within lots of different cultures. We certainly see racism enacted towards Jonathan Small later on. It's kind of like a product of the time. And then Abdullah Khan feels that there is a connection between the English and Sikh soldiers. He says the Sikh knows the Englishman and the Englishman knows the Sikh. This is because soldiers from both communities fought together a lot and fought side by side in a lot of wars. We then move on to Abdullah Khan's narrative. We've been tracking these narratives as we move through. Within this chapter, we've now gone from Watson's narrative describing the interrogation to Jonathan Small's narrative. We're now going into Abdullah Khan's narrative. I've got like a flow chart that I'm going to show you later on about how this narrative shift occurs and where and why it occurs. But here we move on to Abdullah Khan's narrative. He takes over telling the story. So he describes this Raja, and he talks about him as having a low nature and someone that hoards his gold. Now, this is really interesting for me because it's the same as Major Sholto. You could say that Major Sholto has a low nature. He is cunning, he is sly, he doesn't have any kind of honour or loyalty, both things that will be seen as having a high nature. If you are a loyal, honourable person, then you are kind of higher up when it comes to morality. But this Raja has a low nature, and he hoards his gold very much in the same way as Major Sholto. And in this, we have to think about the hollowness of wealth. Major Sholto did not enjoy or appreciate these jewels. Evidently, this Raja did not enjoy or appreciate these jewels. He hoarded them. And in that way, did they ever bring him any joy? Did they ever bring him any happiness? We don't know, but we can assume that if he has this low nature, if he's quite a cunning, horrible person, then he can't have very much joy in his life, can he? We then see that he is not loyal to either side, that this Raja will be friends with both the lion, to mean the UK, and the tiger, to mean India, that his loyalties would flip-flop depending on who was winning, and certainly that's what happens when it comes to him dividing his treasure, keeping half with him and sending half to the British, so that either way he's going to have half of his wealth rather than lose everything. This kind of is the truth about the Agra treasure, that it's come from this Raja and it's been given to this merchant who has kind of tried to secret it across India during the mutiny to get it safe at the Agra fort. So this pretended merchant who travels under the name of Achmet is now in the city of Agra and desires to gain his way into the fort. He has with him as travelling companion my foster brother, Dost Akbar, who knows his secret. Dost Akbar has promised this night to lead him to a side postern of the fort, and has chosen this one for his purpose. Here he will come presently, and here he will find Mahomet Singh and myself awaiting him. The place is lonely, and none shall know of his coming. The world shall know of the merchant Achmet no more, but the great treasure of the Raja shall be divided among us. What say you to it, Sahib? In Worcestershire, the life of a man seems a great and a sacred thing. But it is very different when there is fire and blood all round you, and you have been used to meeting death at every turn. Whether Achmet the merchant lived or died was a thing as light as air to me. But at the talk about the treasure, my heart turned to it, and I thought of what I might do in the old country with it, and how my folk would stare when they saw their ne'er-do-well coming back with his pockets full of gold moidores. I had therefore already made up my mind. Abdullah Khan, however, thinking that I hesitated, pressed the matter more closely. Consider, Sahib, said he, that if this man is taken by the commandant, he will be hung or shot, and his jewels taken by the government, so that no man will be a rupee the better for them. Now, since we do the taking of him, why should we not do the rest as well? The jewels will be as well with us as in the company's coffers. There will be enough to make every one of us rich men and great chiefs. No one can know about the matter, for here we are cut off from all men. What could be better for the purpose? Say again then, Sahib, whether you are with us, or if we must look upon you as an enemy. So then, we get some things around the themes of betrayal. Dost Akbar promises to lead him to the side postern of the fort. The merchant Achmet is arriving at the fort. A fort should be a place of safety, but in this case, the fort is a place of danger. They're going to betray him. And again, the merchant Achmet should be moving towards civilization, but actually he's moving towards an isolated area that again is going to result in his death. So there's kind of a subversion of the protection that a fort should provide here. The fort is providing death, much in the same way that in Macbeth's castle should be providing safety to Duncan, but it doesn't. It provides death. We then see a break in Abdullah Khan's narrative. We kind of move back to Jonathan Small telling the story, and it kind of moves our focus back to the present. Remembering, with all of these narratives and all this narrative shifting, we are dealing with flashbacks. Jonathan Small's narrative is a flashback. Abdullah Khan's narrative is a flashback within a flashback. But now we move back to the present. And Jonathan Small muses on the value of life. He says, in Worcestershire, the life of a man seems a great and sacred thing, but it's very different when there is fire and blood all round. He's saying here in England, life has value. that for certainly English people, but white Europeans on the whole, there is value in their lives. However, in India, there is danger, and therefore there is little value to life. This also may be a reference to kind of the hierarchy between white Western Europeans and Indian people, that the colonialists, the white Europeans, would have literally seen the Indian people's lives as having less value than theirs. It's that whole Eurocentric point of view thing, remember, that if it's not from Europe, it's not worth anything. And that did go on to lives as well, you know. So he talks about meeting death at every turn. He's describing there again the danger, and, you know, if he's seeing massacres happening around him, that must lead you to the conclusion that life has little value. He talks about how the merchant Achmet, living or dying, was a thing as light as air to me. This simile shows that he doesn't care. It shows that there is no consequence for him if the merchant Achmet lives or dies. And now we see the clearest example of how Jonathan Small wants to improve his social position. He talks about what I might do in the old country with it, being the treasure, and about how folk would stare when they saw their ne'er-do-well, their black sheep of the family, coming back with pockets full of gold moidores. This shows he wants to improve his social position. This shows that he wants to use his newfound wealth to move up the social ladder. And I think in this way, Jonathan Small is shown to be still connected to Victorian society, despite the fact that he's been othered throughout the whole novel so far. He still has some connection to the values of Victorian society, and he still wants to defend and uphold those values, which I think is really interesting. And then finally, we see that greed overtakes duty. Abdullah Khan says that the jewels will be as well with us as in the company's coffers, as he quite rightly recognises that if the merchant Achmet is caught with these jewels, he'll be shot, and then the government, the army in the area, will just absorb those jewels into their finances, and they'll just disappear. They'll just evaporate into the into the army's budget. I am with you, heart and soul, said I. It is well, he answered, handing me back my firelock. You see that we trust you, for your word, like ours, is not to be broken. We have now only to wait for my brother and the merchant. Does your brother know, then, of what you will do? I asked. The plan is his. He has devised it. We will go to the gate and share the watch with Malmet Singh. The rain was still falling steadily, for it was just the beginning of the wet season. Brown, heavy clouds were drifting across the sky, and it was hard to see more than a stone cast. A deep moat lay in front of our door, but the water was in places nearly dried up, and it could be easily crossed. It was strange to me to be standing there with those two wild Punjabis, waiting for the man who was coming to his death. Suddenly, my eye caught the glint of a shaded lantern at the other side of the moat. It vanished along the mound heaps, and then appeared again, coming slowly in our direction. Here they are, I exclaimed. You will challenge him, Sahib, as usual, whispered Abdullah. Give him no cause for fear. Send us in with him, and we shall do the rest while you stay here on guard. We have the lantern ready to uncover, that we may be sure that it is indeed the man. The light had flickered onwards, now stopping and now advancing, until I could see two dark figures upon the other side of the moat. I let them scramble down the sloping bank, splash through the mire, and climb halfway up to the gate before I challenged them. Okay, so a few things on this page. So Jonathan Small here, this is kind of a treasonous act. He says, I'm with you heart and soul, remembering that the pact was on heart and soul. So Jonathan Small is saying now, I'm giving everything to this. I'm 100% behind it. And this links with the idea of Victorian fear. The idea that indigenous people would in some way be able to manipulate British people and make them turn against the British government and the army. That is something the Victorians were scared about. We then have more development through pathetic fallacy, the rain, the brown heavy clouds drifting across the sky. So more pathetic fallacy, laying it on that bad things are going to happen. And we see here our first use of animal imagery To describe Abdullah Khan and Malmet Singh, he uses the adjective wild. Two wild Punjabis. This links with them being, like wild animals. And then a little bit of light dark imagery that we'll see developed over the next couple of pages. "Who goes there?" said I, in a subdued voice. "Friends," came the answer. I uncovered my lantern and threw a flood of light upon them. The first was an enormous Sikh with a black beard which swept nearly down to his cummerbund. Outside of a show, I have never seen so tall a man. The other was a little fat round fellow with a great yellow turban and a bundle in his hand done up in a shawl. He seemed to be all in a quiver with fear, for his hands twitched as if he had the ague, and his head kept turning to left and right with two bright little twinkling eyes, like a mouse when he ventures out from his hole. It gave me the chills to think of killing him, but I thought of the treasure, and my heart set as hard as flint within me. When he saw my white face, he gave a little chirrup of joy, and came running up towards me. "Your protection, Sahib," he panted. "Your protection for the unhappy merchant Achmet. I have travelled across Rajputana that I might seek the shelter of the fort at Agra. I have been robbed and beaten and abused because I have been the friend of the company. It is a blessed night this when I am once more in safety. I and my poor possessions." "What have you in the bundle?" I asked. "An iron box," he answered, "which contains one or two little family matters which are of no value to others, but which I should be sorry to lose. Yet I am not a beggar, and I shall reward you, young Sahib, and your governor also, if you will give me the shelter I ask." I could not trust myself to speak longer with the man. The more I looked at his fat, frightened face, the harder did it seem that we should slay him in cold blood. It was best to get it over. Okay, so we start this page here. We must remember light dark imagery and remember what light and darkness have represented in this novel so far. And that is that light is goodness and protection, and darkness is evil and danger. Now, here we have a subversion of that. It's kind of turned upside down. Jonathan Small is the provider of light, like he is supposed to be their salvation. However, this is ironic because the light in this instance is bringing death to the merchant Achmet. So we must think about that. We then get a reference to Achmet being a little fat round fellow, showing his greed, and then the great yellow turban, remembering the symbolism behind this colour yellow all the time. I think there are two things here. So it could represent cowardice, that Achmet is a cowardly man, but at the same time, it could be an indication of wealth. Remembering when Holmes and Watson and Mary Morstan arrive at Thaddeus Sholto's house, when they open the door, they're greeted by a man in a yellow turban. I think there must be some symbolism behind that. And the man in that yellow turban was leading Mary Morstan to wealth. Thaddeus Sholto was going to give her money because they found the treasure. In this instance, the merchant Achmet, he's leading Jonathan Small to wealth. He's leading them all to wealth. So I think yellow, in this instance, definitely could represent wealth. Okay, so then we see that Achmet is weak. He's all in a quiver with fear. Very similar to Thaddeus Sholto, the merchant Achmet, with his two bright little twinkling eyes again. And we see, through this simile, that Jonathan Small has no compassion for the merchant Achmet at this point. He says, "My heart set as hard as a flint within me," that he consciously tried to block out any feelings that he felt of guilt. We then have a little bit of animal imagery for the merchant Achmet. The use of this word chirrup. This is like a baby bird. Again, this is a weak animal, prey animal, unable to defend itself. And then we get some lies, a little bit of dramatic irony. The merchant Achmet says, "I've been robbed and beaten and abused." Well, he can't have been robbed, because if he'd been robbed, they'd have found the jewels, and he's got them with him. So this is him kind of telling a little tale to try and elicit Jonathan Small's sympathy more. And then we get more lies. He talks about the contents of the box have no value, that they are little family matters, all that kind of stuff. So he's lying to Jonathan Small to try and make him not look in the box. But eventually Jonathan Small's emotional weakness comes out. He says, the more I looked at his fat, frightened face, the harder did it seem that we should slay him in cold blood. So this is Jonathan Small setting himself up as not a murderer, which again, we can take that on face value and think, okay, maybe Jonathan Small's not a murderer, but at the same time, we must think of him as an unreliable narrator. Maybe he's just saying this to try to make Holmes and Watson more sympathetic towards him. Take him to the main guard, I said. The two Sikhs... Sorry, 1 second. There we go. The two Sikhs closed in on him on each side, and the giant walked behind him while they marched in through the dark gateway. Never was a man so compassed round with death. I remained at the gateway with the lanterns. I could hear the measured tramp of their footsteps sounding through the lonely corridors. Suddenly ceased, and I heard voices and a scuffle with the sound of blows. A moment later there came, to my horror, a rush of footsteps coming in my direction, with the loud breathing of a running man. I turned my lantern down the long straight passage, and there was the fat man, running like the wind, with a smear of blood across his face, and close at his heels, bounding like a tiger, the great black-bearded Sikh with a knife flashing in his hand. I have never seen a man run so fast as that little merchant. He was gaining on the Sikh, and I could see that if he once passed me and got to the open air, he would save himself yet. My heart softened to him, but again the thought of his treasure turned me hard and bitter. I cast my file up between his legs as he raced past, and he rolled twice over like a shot rabbit. Ere he could stagger to his feet, the Sikh was upon him and buried his knife twice in his side. The man never uttered moan nor moved muscle, but lay where he had fallen. I think myself that he may have broken his neck with the fall. You see, gentlemen, that I am keeping my promise. I am telling you every work of the business just exactly as it happened, whether it is my favour or not. He stopped and held out his manacled hands for the whisky and water which Holmes had brewed for him. For myself, I confess that I had now conceived the utmost horror of the man, not only for this cold-blooded business in which he had been concerned, but even more for the somewhat flippant and careless way in which he narrated it. Whatever punishment was in store for him, I felt that he might expect no sympathy from me. Let's just cover this then. So here's a really, really nice metaphor to start with. He talks about the merchant Achmet. Never was a man so compassed round with death, to indicate that he was surrounded by death. A compass in every single direction, north, east, south, west, that Achmet is completely surrounded by death. Then moving on to Jonathan Small's narrative proper, he talks now about the actual murder of the merchant Achmet. He says, to my horror, showing that he doesn't want to kill him, that he didn't want any part of the murder of Achmet. He then uses more animal imagery to describe, this will be Dost Akbar, bounding like a tiger, strong, violent animal imagery, predatory animal imagery, with his knife flashing in his hand. To counter that, we get animal imagery used when describing the merchant Achmet. He talks when he is shot that he rolled twice over like a shot rabbit, a weak animal, a prey animal, that this is a tiger hunting a rabbit. And just before that, we see how Jonathan Small's greed beats his feelings, beats his softness. So my heart softened to him, but again the thought of his treasure turned me hard and bitter. This juxtaposition of being soft and hard. So he has some sympathy for the merchant Achmet. He doesn't want to see a man die, but at the same time, he personally wants that treasure. He wants that money. And so he forces himself to be hard and bitter, which means that he's able to shoot him. We then get more references to Jonathan Small wanting to be seen as honest. And finally, we shift onto Watson's narrative. So we've had Watson to Jonathan Small, to Abdullah Khan, to Jonathan Small, back to Watson. So we see here that Watson doesn't like Jonathan Small. He says, I had now conceived the almost horror of the man, so that he had worked out that this guy was pretty dangerous. Talking about how he committed this cold-blooded business. But at the same time, He talks about how he doesn't like his lack of remorse, the flippant and careless way in which he narrated. He didn't like that he wasn't more apologetic about his conduct. He felt that it was wrong, that Jonathan Small seemed to act like what he'd done was right. Kind of that even that what he'd done was his kind of due, that he was owed this. So starting here. Sherlock Holmes and Jones sat with their hands upon their knees, deeply interested in the story, but with the same disgust written upon their faces. He may have observed it, for there was a touch of defiance in his voice and manner as he proceeded. "It was all very bad, no doubt," said he. "I should like to know how many fellows in my shoes would have refused a share of this loot, when they knew that they would have their throats cut for their pains. Besides, it was my life or his. When once he was in the fort, if he got out, the whole business would come to light, and I should have been court-martialed and shot as likely as not, for people were not very lenient at the time like that." "Go on with your story," said Holmes shortly. "Well, we carried him in, Abdullah Akbar and I. A fine weight he was too, for all that he was so short. Mahomet Singh was left to guard the door. We took him to a place which the Sikhs had already prepared. It was some distance off, where a winding passage leads to a great empty hall, the brick walls of which were all crumbling to pieces. The earth floor had sunk in at one place, making a natural graves. So we left the merchant there, having first covered him over with loose bricks. This done, we all went back to the treasure. It lay where he had dropped it when he was first attacked. The box was the same which now lies upon your table. A key was hung by a silken cord to that carved handle upon the top. We opened it, and the light of the lantern gleamed upon a collection of gems, such as I have read of and thought about when I was a little lad at Pershore. It was blinding to look upon them. When we had feasted our eyes, we took them all out and made a list of them." Okay, so here, this is again a juxtaposition between Watson and Sherlock Holmes. Watson is disgusted and shocked and moved by the story, but Sherlock Holmes and Athelney Jones, they just sit with their hands upon their knees, interested. But there was some disgust on their faces. So they are disgusted with the story to some extent, but I don't really think they are as disgusted as Watson. But Jonathan Small, he really doesn't care. He continues with some defiance. So now this. Think about this. "I should like to know how many fellows in my shoes would have refused a share of this loot." And someone in Jonathan Small's shoes would be someone with no prospects. Somebody who wasn't going to earn lots of money, who was just going to live their lives doing the dull, everyday, regular things that working class people would have done in this time. So it could be that. He could be talking about someone that has an inability to improve themselves socially. At the same time, he could be talking about somebody who could die at any point, somebody whose life was on the line. If somebody said, "Steal this thing or die," what would you do? And that's reflected here when he says, "It was my life or his." This is a pragmatic statement linked with self-preservation, that Jonathan Small wanted to preserve his life, but at the same time, this goes back to, is it Jonathan Small justifying his actions? Is it Jonathan Small trying to make Holmes and Watson understand why he did the things that he did, or at least justify the things that he did? He then personifies the treasure. It lay where we had dropped it, making the treasure somewhat of a character, and the treasure is a bit of a character in the story. We then get some exotic descriptions: the silken cord, the carved handle, the gleaming gems. All of this seems exotic, extravagant, lavish, all that kind of stuff. And then we get another little reference to Jonathan Small's childhood, that this amount of gems was something that he had read of and thought about when I was a little lad at Pershore. This shows that when Jonathan Small was young, he liked adventure, fantasy stories, and it's like it wasn't real. Like the collection of gems wasn't real, like he wasn't really there, but this whole thing was just a bit of a dream. When we had feasted our eyes, so this talks about greed, using the verb feasted. Come on, photos, doing. When he uses the verb feasted, this is around consumption. The idea that they were consuming the gems with their eyes. Okay. We took them all out and made a list. There were 143 diamonds of the first water, including one which has been called, I believe, the Great Mogul, and is said to be the second largest stone in existence. Then there were 97 very fine emeralds and 170 rubies, some of which, however, were small. There were 40 carbuncles, 210 sapphires, 61 agates, and a great quantity of beryls, onyxes, cat's eyes, turquoises, and other stones, the very names of which I did not know at the time, though I have become more familiar with them since. Besides this, there were nearly 300 very fine pearls, 12 of which were set in a gold coronet. By the way, these last had been taken out of the chest, and were not there when I recovered it. After we had counted our treasures, we put them back into the chest, and carried them to the gateway to show them to Mahomet Singh. Then we solemnly renewed our oath to stand by each other and be true to our secret. We agreed to conceal our loot in a safe place until the country should be at peace again, and then to divide it equally among ourselves. There was no use dividing it at present, for if gems of such value were found upon us it would cause suspicion, and there was no privacy in the fort, nor any place where we could keep them. We carried the box, therefore, into the same hall where we had buried the body, and there, under certain bricks in the best preserved wall, we made a hollow and put our treasure. We made careful note of the place, and next day I drew 4 plans, one for each of us, and put the sign of 4 of us at the bottom, for we had sworn that we should each always act for all, so that none might take advantage. That is an oath that I can put my hand to my heart and swear that I have never broken. So now this is interesting. Jonathan Small gives the full details of the treasure here. Now bear in mind, this was potentially some 30 odd years ago that Jonathan Small made this list. I think this shows that Jonathan Small has thought about this a lot, and he must have thought about it a lot to remember all of these details. This links back to Sherlock Holmes. Remember these 3 quotes that we must remember. Sherlock Holmes, a pretty demonstration. Athelney Jones, a pretty business. And Jonathan Small, a pretty justice. That justice is Jonathan Small's obsession, and getting the treasure back for Jonathan Small is the supreme justice. That he wants to get this treasure back, that he spent so much time thinking about, mulling over and remembering and contemplating. And we then get a little call back to the pearls that were sent to Mary Morstan. He talks about how some were in this coronet, this kind of band, this kind of crown kind of thing. And he says that these last had been taken out of the chest and were not there when I recovered it. This shows Jonathan Small as somewhat of an honest character, that he would make that reference. We then get more honesty among thieves, that they solemnly renewed our oath to stand by each other and be true to our secret, that they should divide it equally among ourselves. Again, these thieves are honourable, and that is a direct contrast to the way that Major Sholto behaves. Major Sholto is dishonourable, and Jonathan Small is honourable. We get the reference to the sign of 4, that this is the sign of 4 now, and that is an oath that I can put my hand to my heart and swear that I have never broken. So Jonathan Small is presented as honourable and someone who sticks by his friends. Now, as we read the final part of this chapter in the next video, I do want you to think about, how is this different to Sholto? How is Sholto not honourable when it comes to his friends? How does he treat them badly? Well, there's no use my telling you, gentlemen, what came of the Indian Mutiny. After Wilson took Delhi and Sir Colin relieved Lucknow, the back of the business was broken. Fresh troops came pouring in, and Nana Sahib made himself scarce over the frontier. A flying column under Colonel Greathead came round to Agra and cleared the Pandis away from it. Peace seemed to be settling upon the country, and we four were beginning to hope that the time was at hand when we might safely go off with our shares of the plunder. In a moment, however, our hopes were shattered by our being arrested as the murderers of Achmet. It came about in this way. When the Rajah put his jewels into the hands of Achmet, he did it because he knew that he was a trusty man. They are suspicious folk in the East, however, so what does this Rajah do but take a second, even more trusty servant and set him to play the spy upon the first? This second man was ordered never to let Achmet out of his sight, and he followed him like his shadow. He went after him that night and saw him pass through the doorway. Of course, he thought he had taken refuge in the fort and applied for admission there himself next day, but could find no trace of Achmet. This seemed to him so strange that he spoke about it to a sergeant of guides who brought it to the ears of the commandant. A thorough search was quickly made, and the body was discovered. Thus, at the very moment that we thought that all was safe, we were all four seized and brought to trial on a charge of murder. 3 of us because we held the gate that night, and the 4th because he was known to have been in the company of the murdered man. Not a word about the jewels came out at the trial, for the Rajah had been deposed and driven out of India, so no one had any particular interest in them. Here's just a few little points here. We have details of the Indian Mutiny here. Jonathan Small talks about the arrest leading to his hopes being shattered. Just more details. And the jewels remain a mystery. Luck and circumstance lead to the jewels being hidden and secreted away. Nobody knows that they're there. Okay. The murder, however, was clearly made out, and it was certain that we must all have been concerned in it. The 3 Sikhs got penal servitude for life, and I was commended to death, though my sentence was afterwards commuted into the same as the others. It was rather a queer position that we found ourselves in then. There we were, all 4 tied by the leg, and with precious little chance of ever getting out again, while we each held a secret which might have put each of us in a palace if we'd only have made use of it. It was enough to make a man eat his heart out to have to stand the kick and the cuff of every petty jack in office, to have rice to eat and water to drink, when that gorgeous fortune was ready for him outside, just waiting to be picked up. It might have driven me mad, but I was always a pretty stubborn one, so I just held on and bided my time. Okay, just really quickly then, so the penal servitude and the penal servitude for Jonathan Small, this shows that they are all now working as slaves. And remember that the oath is binding upon a Ferengi statement that Jonathan Small would be in more trouble than the others. Initially, that's what happens. Jonathan Small is condemned to death, while the 3 Sikhs end up with servitude for life, being in prison for life. So this shows that the British would have seen Jonathan Small as somewhat of a traitor. Tied by the leg is a euphemism for prison. And then we have this juxtaposing imagery. The idea that they had to, where's it gone? Eat rice and drink water while there was a gorgeous fortune waiting outside for them. That they held a secret which might have put each of us in a palace. Compare that to being in prison, tied by the leg or in a palace. So there is that juxtaposing imagery. And then finally, we get Jonathan Small admitting that he is very stubborn, so it did not drive him mad. Now again, think about Jonathan Small as an unreliable narrator. Is he 100% sane? Or was he mad to have broken out of prison and ended up back in Britain, trying to steal the treasure, trying to get revenge on Major Sholto, ending back up in prison, when he could have just lived the rest of his life in peace and freedom? So, is Jonathan Small mad, or is Jonathan Small sane? It's a point of contention. Okay guys, so that was video number 2 from chapter 12. I'll be back with the final video number 3 for chapter 12 shortly. Okay, I'll speak to you all soon. Thanks, bye bye.